lowly of heart, the various kinds of prayer and thanksgiving, such and such like are the subjects treated of. The speculative spirit which is visible throughout shews that the great leaders of asceticism were not unfaithful to the Christian philosophy, which was still found in the Alexandrian schools. The influence of the book was immense, as St. Benedict ordered it to be constantly read at a certain hour in the houses of his order, and it was perhaps the philosophic thought which is found in many of the collations which gave to the monks that bent to mental toil and abstract discussion which made the monasteries of the West for many generations the chief centres of literature and intellectual life. But all the efforts of previous founders of monasteries fall into the shade when we compare them with those of Benedict of Nursia. The career of the Benedictine order is the most signal testimony to the virtue and the wisdom of its first legislator. Benedict, the son of a noble family in Umbria, received a literary education in Rome, but, shocked at the dissipated life which he saw around him, fled at an early age from the great city and took refuge in an almost inaccessible cave in the Sabine hills, near Subiaco, where he depended for sustenance on the charity of the neighbours. Like very many who have attempted to crush the natural passions, he was haunted by visions of the fair forms which he had left behind. He shared the fate of other famous hermits, in that his solitude became populous with the throng of men who were attracted by his fame. It was probably this circumstance which induced him to forsake Subiaco with his companions, and to journey southward to Monte Cassino in Campania, where he founded what became the most famous monastery in the world, the model after which, more or less directly, all other western monasteries have been formed. The rule which he gave was stern, but not too stern for human frailty to endure. It trained men to be strong, not fanciful. At the head of every monastery was a paternal ruler, an abbot, chosen by the major part of the monks themselves. Under him was a prepositus, or provost, whom he appointed, and again under him, if the monastery was so large as to require them, subordinates called decani, or deans, who took the superintendence each of 10 brethren. As each new brother was admitted to a monastery, he was required to pledge himself in the most solemn manner to the 3 great principles of monastic life: firmness of resolution, change of life, and obedience to God and his saints. As it was of the very essence of monastic vows that they should be lifelong, no one was allowed to take them until he had passed through a period of probation, in which every opportunity was given to the novice to learn the real nature of his own calling, and to the superiors of the society to discover whether he had the qualities which a good monk should have. With a view of deterring waverers, the act of reception was made an especially solemn one. The novice to be received had to lay on the altar of the church of the monastery, with solemn invocation of the saints whose relics were there, a written engagement to observe the rule. The man who could not with a clear conscience affirm his earnest intention of remaining in the brotherhood to his life's end could be no true monk, nor the man who could not resign his natural wishes and passions so as to be guided in all things by the monastic rule. As in the rule of Pachomius, so in the Benedictine, not only did the brethren observe the several hours of the divine office, but they had to undertake regular manual labour, often of some severity. Idleness was, their founder thought, the mortal enemy of the soul. In order to cut off any excuse for the monks absenting themselves from their house, each convent was enjoined to provide for itself, so far as might be, all necessary supplies of food and clothes, and the like. The third vow bound the monk to the most absolute and implicit obedience to the superior. Whatever was commanded by one in authority, he was bound to obey at once as a divine command. This prompt obedience was the first step in the road to humility. By it the monk testified that nothing was dearer to him than the work of Christ. When the novice was required to regard his abbot as one who stood in the place of Christ, we may clearly see that the Benedictine order was from the first a church within the church. What the bishop was to the diocese, that was the abbot to his convent. The difference was that the narrower circle aimed at a higher level of Christian life than was possible for the wider. And as the strength of the church lies in the fact that it is a growing tree capable of adapting itself to its environment, so the Benedictine order, without departing from the intention of its founder, has been able to accommodate itself to each of the many ages through which it has lived. Benedict did not enjoin upon his monks an excessive asceticism. While his principles were stern and unbending, he did not make the monastic life wearisome by petty restrictions. His rule became the model for all the monastic rules of the West, in which we consequently find, with all differences of detail, a certain uniformity of type. The great glory of the Benedictine order is, that it impressed upon a world in the process of dissolution the capacity for renewal which is to be found in a life of order, industry, obedience, and simplicity. Whether in the humbler office of tilling the land, or in the higher of preserving literature and promoting sound and thorough study, the Benedictines have a well-earned fame, though they wrought for the sake of the work, and not for their own glory. The literary labours, however, for which the Benedictines have been so distinguished, were not directly prescribed by the founder. The credit of setting monks to work at literature belongs to Cassiodorus. Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus, or Cassiodorius, was a Roman of distinguished family, who held high offices of state under the Gothic king Theodoric. On the fall of the East Gothic kingdom in 540, being now an old man, he withdrew to his property in Bruttium, where he founded a convent, the Monasterium Beveriens. He thought it nobler to be the slave of Christ than to rule the kingdoms of this world. In the wreck of the empire he was anxious to preserve learning. To this end he gave to his society his own excellent library, which he continued to augment until his death. Not only were the monks incited by his example to the study of classical and sacred literature, he trained them likewise to the careful transcription of manuscripts, in the purchase of which large sums were continually dispersed. Bookbinding, gardening, and medicine were among the pursuits of the less intellectual members of the fraternity. The system took root and spread beyond the boundaries of Italy, so that the multiplication of manuscripts became gradually as much a recognized employment of monastic life as prayer or fasting. The tendency to asceticism was not unopposed. Even St. Chrysostom, himself a monk and an earnest advocate of monastic life, emphatically rejected the distinction which was in his day commonly drawn between the counsels of perfection which were for the few, and the easier precepts which might suffice for the many. He knew how degrading was the notion that men could not attain true Christian life in the midst of the family and the world. The Beatitudes, the precepts of the Lord in his apostles, these are not for the monk alone, but for all the members of Christ. A man who has a wife and children may see the Lord, as Isaiah saw him, if he has but Isaiah's spirit. Those who run away from the world in which the battle has to be fought are deserters from the great army. A very different kind of critic was Jovinian, who had also originally been a monk, but had become convinced of the unsoundness of the principle on which monasticism was generally defended. He declared, it was said, that the merits of virgins are just the same as those of the married and the widowed who have been baptized into Christ, if the general holiness of their lives is the same, and that abstinence from food has no higher merit than the thankful participation of it. Unorthodox opinions are also attributed to him with which we are not at present concerned. Jovinian's reasoning is said to have influenced certain nuns so strongly that they broke their vows and married. His teaching excited the indignation of Pope Siricius, who in a consistory of the Roman clergy condemned and excommunicated him and 8 of his adherents as guilty of innovation and heresy. Jovinian betook himself to Milan, hoping perhaps for the protection of the emperor, who then held his court there. But in matters of faith, Ambrose was there almost all-powerful, and from Milan also the heretic had to flee. Ambrose also issued a letter of warning against some of his own monks, who, like Jovinian, denied the peculiar merit of celibacy. Monks, as such, were at first simply lay people, and attended the services, or at any rate received the Eucharist, at some neighbouring church. In process of time, however, it was felt to be unfitting that the brethren of a monastery should depend for sacred ministrations on the clergy of a church which, as the founders of religious houses preferred remote sites, was often at some distance, and it became customary for one of the older brethren, generally the abbot himself, to be a presbyter and to administer the sacraments within the convent walls. The society had then precisely the same relationship to the bishop of the diocese as a village with its presbyter. It was not until the time of Benedict that it was regarded as essential for a convent to have its own church and its own clergy. But as the monastic life was regarded as the highest form of Christianity, and attracted many men who would otherwise have become clergymen, it became usual from the time of Pope Siricius to ordain monks. From the end of the fourth century, in fact,